Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Dr. Nandita Krishna, distinguished guests. I have great pleasure in welcoming you to the discussion of the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy on green policies and the legacy of Indira Gandhi, with Jairam Ramesh discussing his new book, Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature, with Nandita Krishna. The Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy is a division of Kasturi and Sons, publishers of the Hindu group of newspapers. It was inaugurated by the President of India, Pranab Mukherjee, on January 31st, 2013. The aim of the Hindu Center is to promote research, dialogue, and discussion to enable the creation of informed public opinion on key issues facing India in order to safeguard, strengthen, and nourish parliamentary democracy and pluralism, and to contribute to the nation's economic, social, and political betterment. The Hindu Center has so far supported 24 public policy scholars who have submitted research papers and reports on areas such as parliamentary democracy, freedom of expression, content of school textbooks, financial inclusion, and rural broadband connectivity, which are all published online at the center's website. The center has also organized 20 public events, consultations, and public discussions on key issues of national importance, including the creation of the Telangana state, violence against women, pre-election opinion polls, Right to Education Act, the Sri Lankan Tamil refugees in India, sedition and free speech in India, the politics of welfare in Tamil Nadu, the union budget, and most recently, demonetization and black money in India. The Hindu Center's first annual lecture, Will India Script an Uninterrupted Growth Story, was delivered in March this year by P. Chidambaram, former Union Finance Minister. The center has also organized lectures on climate change by Jairam Ramesh and by Alan Rusbridger, former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. Today's is the 21st public event of the Hindu Center. Jairam Ramesh, of course, does not need an elaborate introduction. He has been a prolific writer, both in and outside government, and keeps producing a book every 3 or 6 months now. A few months ago, the Hindu Center hosted a discussion on his book on the 1921 economic reforms, in which his note on what needed to be done, written when he was on the Planning Commission, played a significant role. He has been a member of the Rajya Sabha since July 2004. He has been Minister of State for Commerce and Power, Minister of State with independent charge of Environment and Forests, and Cabinet Minister for Drinking Water and Sanitation and Rural Development. He is the author of a number of well-known books, including Green Signals, Ecology, Growth and Democracy in India, To the Brink and Back, India's 1991 Story, Old History, New Geography, Bifurcating Andhra Pradesh, and Making Sense of China, Reflections on China and India. His latest book, Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature, which is being discussed this evening, you would all have seen the book outside. It is a voluminous, well-researched book with a great deal of material for future research as well. He has been a columnist and a TV personality, and is also the senior visiting fellow at the Hindu Center. The people of Chennai are familiar with the work and contribution of Dr. Nandita Krishna, the areas of heritage, education, environment, and culture, among others. She has a PhD in ancient Indian culture from Bombay University. She is the president of the C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer Foundation, founder of its many constituents, including CPR Education Center, and is also a professor at Madras University. She is the author of several books, including Sacred Plants of India, Sacred Animals of India, and Hinduism and Nature, that is under publication, among others, besides several research papers and popular articles. She has been documenting the ecological traditions of India for the Invasive website of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. The subject of discussion would be the little explored side of Indira Gandhi, how her personal interest and concern for the environment shaped her public policies on environment and wildlife conservation. Indira Gandhi was quintessentially a political personality with a mixed but largely positive legacy. We are all familiar with how she outmaneuvered the old guard and gained control of the Congress party. Her popular appeal that won her 2 huge mandates, her fiercely independent foreign policy, her standing up to the United States during the Bangladesh crisis, and her welfare programs. Her not-so-positive side was in evidence in her authoritarian style and the imposition of the emergency. Mr. Ramesh's book contains a wealth of information from official and non-official sources, including memoirs. It notes how the early influence nurtured Indira Gandhi's interest in nature and ecology, how her friendship and keenness to interact with scientists, writers, academics, and conservationists, including the birdman Salim Ali, and her openness to ideas helped her shape policies. At the UN Conference on Human Environment, held in Stockholm in 1972, she made the oft-quoted statement, "Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters?" This seemed to suggest that in the face of massive poverty, ecological concerns were of secondary importance. Yet, her policies and priorities in office had a clear focus on ecology and wildlife, and she pursued programs even if they did not advance her political interests in any way. Her dilemma was to balance her concern for ecology with the demands of development. And in the case of Silent Valley and the Terry projects, and in formulating the notion of the 500-meter coastal zone to be kept free of buildings and other activities, to take 3 instances, she chose to weigh in on the side of ecology. The several facets of Indira Gandhi continue to hold a great deal of fascination for us still, and we look forward to a very interesting conversation between Jairam Ramesh and Nandita Krishna, and the audience interaction that is to follow. Now, could I request Dr. Nandita Krishna to take over and conduct the proceedings?
Thank you, Mr. Ravi. This book, I have read the whole book, and I think I'm one of the few people in Chennai, probably the only one, because it hasn't yet come into the bookstores, who has read the whole book. And it's quite fascinating. It's very fascinating because we know, as Mr. Ravi said, we know Indira Gandhi's so many other facets. So I'm going to start with a question for Mr. Jairam Ramesh. You are in the Congress, you are a politician, you've known her as a politician. So I know you've been Minister for Environment and Forests, but there you were probably doing a lot of other work. So how did you get the idea to do a book on Indira Gandhi, her life in nature?
Well, there have been many books on Indira Gandhi, many biographies. And all these biographies have been political biographies, focused, as Mr. Ravi said, on Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, the politician. And they have tended to fall in one of two camps. The first camp is the Durga camp. She is this great political leader, powerful. She took on Nixon, she took on Pakistan, she redrew the geography of South Asia, and in Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's famous description, she emerged as Durga. So that's the one school. There is the second school, which is she is the architect of the emergency. She forgot that she was Nehru's daughter, but she always remembered that she was Sanjay's mother, and therefore encouraged Maruti, which led, subsequently to the imposition of the emergency, the abrogation of civil rights, and so on and so forth. So broadly, the biographies fall in these two categories. But neither of the two schools has bothered to ask the question, who was the real Indira Gandhi? What was she as a person? How did she grow up? What were the influences on her? Why did she become what she became? And it was clear to me that when I became Minister for Environment in 2009, that almost the entire legacy that we have today on environmental matters, we owe to Indira Gandhi. So I sort of was vaguely familiar. But now that we are celebrating in fact, 2017 is an unusual year. We are celebrating the centenary of the two Russian revolutions. We are celebrating the centenary of the Champaran Satyagraha. We are celebrating a century of the Balfour Declaration. We are celebrating the birth centenary of John F. Kennedy, and we're also celebrating the birth centenary of Indira Gandhi. So centenaries are occasions for reflecting and recalling the lives of people who have shaped contemporary history. And my sole objective, Nandita, was to discover Indira Gandhi through her own eyes. A biographer always tends to impose his or her own perceptions on the subject. But I wanted to avoid that, and I wanted to ask myself the question, who did Indira Gandhi think she was? How did she believe? One of her most famous lines she quoted in an interview in 1971. She quotes a line from Peter Sellers. There was a very famous film called The Party, where Peter Sellers, he's an Indian, he goes to England, he does not know how to use toilet paper, and he keeps rolling the toilet paper in the bathroom, and the landlady comes and says, "Who do you think you are?" And Peter Sellers responds, "In India, madam, we don't think who we are, we know who we are." So, so who was this Indira Gandhi? And I think that's what I have tried to explore in this book. And the conclusion, the controversial conclusion that I have come to is that Indira Gandhi was a reluctant politician. She was born in politics, she grew up in politics, she matured in politics, she became a politician par excellence, but she was uncomfortable being a politician. At heart, she was a naturalist. She was somebody who cared deeply for nature, and at every point of time when she had an opportunity, she always thought of going into that life. But politics is a very strange profession. It's a chakravyuha. You get into it and you don't know how to get out of it. So I think Indira Gandhi was the Abhimanyu, so to speak, and she didn't know how to get out of politics, but she used nature. She used her private calling, her private passion for nature, and made it a public concern. And Mr. Ravi referred to the Stockholm speech, her most famous speech on the 14th of June, 1972. where incidentally she quotes from the Atharva Veda, and she announces to the world what India is going to do in the field of environmental conservation. And till today, you talk to anybody in the world, her Stockholm speech is still remembered.
In fact, your book makes a very interesting suggestion. We all think of Indira Gandhi as Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter. He was a politician above all, and yes, there was a love of history in his discovery of India, but he was a politician through and through, maybe because that's what he was doing from a very young age. But in your book, you have shown how the influences in her life were her mother and her mother's family. And maybe that is what made her so different.
I think in all Indian families, the mother's brother occupies a special place. And in Indira Gandhi's case, her mother's brother, the youngest brother of Kamala Nehru, Kailash Nath Kaul, was a very distinguished botanist. Nehru only studied botany in Cambridge. Kailash Nath Kaul actually practiced botany. And it was through the maternal uncle that she developed a passion for nature. A second reason why she became a naturalist at a very young age, because of her mother's illness. She was suffering from tuberculosis. So Kamala Nehru had to go to hill stations to recover. Kashmir, Shimla, Mashobra, Mahabaleshwar, Panchgani, Nainital, and Switzerland. And she goes to school in Switzerland because of her mother's, being a patient in a sanitarium there. So a lot of these things are childhood influences on her. Of course, Nehru keeps writing to her about history and so on and so forth. Then in 1942, she goes to jail for 1 year and she discovers Salim Ali. In jail, she discovers Salim Ali because her father presents her with Salim Ali's book, the classic book, the Handbook of Indian Birds. And Indira Gandhi becomes a bird watcher. And it's very interesting. She is a founder member of the Delhi Bird Watching Society. And she comes into nature because of bird watching. And there is one other figure in her life, Horace Alexander, the famous Quaker, who very close to Mahatma Gandhi, who's also an ornithologist of sorts. So, these were the influences on her before 1950, which made her a child of the mountains, somebody relating to nature, somebody relating to birds particularly. And I think this is what you saw later on when she becomes Prime Minister as well.
In fact, the Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary is sort of woven right through the book. It keeps popping up from time to time. Maybe you could tell everybody a little bit about her efforts, not only in Bharatpur, but in setting up so many sanctuaries.
Well, there are, very famous stories in this book. The Bharatpur Sanctuary is one of the most important that goes through the entire book. But let me take two examples which people of Chennai will relate to. In 1973, she and Mr. Karunanidhi are having an exchange of letters on the Mudumalai Sanctuary because Mr. Karunanidhi is hell-bent on building a hydroelectric project right in the middle of the sanctuary. And Rukmini Devi Arundel is mortified, and so is M. Krishnan, the great naturalist. Both Krishnan and Rukmini Devi petition Indira Gandhi for saving Mudumalai Sanctuary. And Indira Gandhi keeps writing letters to Mr. Karunanidhi. Mr. Karunanidhi is not moved by that, but she spends a good part of 18 months, and finally the Moyar hydroelectric project is abandoned. In 1976, she comes to Chennai, and she addresses what is considered to be the largest political gathering in Indian political history, when Mr. Kamraj's followers come back to the Congress, headed by Mr. Mupanar in Marina Beach. The next day, she has 45 minutes to spare, and she goes to the snake farm. And while she's at the snake farm, Harry Miller approaches her and says, "Madam, the Madras Deer Park is being encroached upon, and the state government wants to give away more of this land for construction." So again, poor Mr. Karunanidhi is at the receiving end of a barrage of letters from Indira Gandhi. And finally, the consequence of that is that the Madras Deer Park is declared a sanctuary. It's one of the smallest sanctuaries, actually, but it was declared a sanctuary to protect it from the land being given away for other purposes. So there are many other examples like this where, she, by the way, she never liked visiting sanctuaries and national parks because she believed that her security would completely destroy the park before she goes and after she has left. So she never visited many of these national parks. She visited only 2 or 3 of them in her long career. She went to Gir, she went to Kanha, she never went to Corbett. So, but the 1972 Wildlife Protection Act, which till today is being followed, if there is one law that has protected wildlife in this country, it is the Wildlife Protection Act. The national parks, the sanctuaries, the ban on the shooting of animals, particularly tigers. See, one interesting thing, Nandita, is that all the people around Indira Gandhi in the 50s and 60s were ex-Maharajas. And all these ex-Maharajas had spent their lifetime killing tigers. And they were suffering from this great guilt complex, and they became great conservationists. The Maharaja of Mysore, the Maharaja of Bhavnagar, the Maharaja of Bikaner, Dr. Karan Singh, the son of the Maharaja of, ex-Maharaja of Kashmir, Maharaja of Wankaner, all these guys, they became the conservationists. Do you know that till 1970, tigers could be shot in this country? There was no ban on the shooting of tigers till 1970. Mrs. Gandhi imposes a moratorium on the 5-year moratorium on the shooting of tigers. And everybody is opposed to it, including some of our own chief ministers. Shamacharan Shukla, for example, doesn't want, because a lot of tourists who come to India were coming to shoot tigers. One of the most famous incidents was Prince Philip coming to India in 1961 and shooting a tiger in Rajasthan. And he's posed next to the tiger as well. So in 1972, the Wildlife Protection Act comes, and that creates this large network of sanctuaries and national parks, which we see today, across the country. It's not just tigers, by the way. It's, all animals. Lions, tigers, crocodiles, the gharials. She was very much concerned about the gharials. One of her favorite species was the black buck, and she created black buck sanctuaries. Pygmy hog, which is one of the smallest species, she was very concerned about the extinction of pygmy hogs. So I think the point she makes later on is that by protecting tigers, you're protecting forests. It's not just protecting one species, you're protecting actually forest areas. And I think that's the larger vision that informed her interventions.
But while the Indian Board for Wildlife banned the shooting of 14 animals, I'm surprised that it didn't include the tiger. Why? Was it for the sake of the Maharajas?
All the Maharajas. In 1952, the Indian Board on Wildlife is constituted under the chairmanship of the great Maharaja of Mysore, one of the greatest musicologists that India has produced. They have their first meeting in Mysore in December of 1952. 14 animals are classified as endangered, and the tiger is not part of that list. Because half the members of the Indian Board on Wildlife are ex-Maharajas. Of course, at that time they were still Maharajas. Ex-Maharajas only after 1970. They were all Maharajas. And they did not ban the shooting of tigers. And they did not make tiger an endangered species. Tiger becomes an endangered species only in 1970.
There is a hint on page 96 that one of the reasons why she chose to abolish privy purses and privileges especially was because she was very upset with the Maharajas killing the tiger.
Well,
You have
that's a-
hinted that. Now, you can speak a little more truthfully. We won't take you to court.
No, she
from
was getting irritated. She was getting increasingly irritated that these Maharajas and were all. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only reason why the privy purses were abolished, but fact is that she was getting increasingly irritated at the fact that her orders were being flouted because many of these conservationists were actually royals. But no, I mean I use that as an aside. So don't make that as if that I have ascribed to Mrs. Gandhi that reason. But there's one other factors that may well have caused her to do that.
Well, apart from wildlife, she was a supporter of the International Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in Experimentation. Then after seeing a zoo, she wrote very sadly about it. Was she also an animal welfare enthusiast? I'd like to know.
Well, I'm not going to say anything on Jallikattu.
Don't. I'm talking about animal welfare.
Yeah, she was. I think she was certainly an animal welfare, very much concerned about animal welfare.
Okay.
She was, not just mega species, but all species. She was certainly. Would she have been an activist? Well, one of the points I make in my book is that Mrs. Gandhi was not an environmentalist. She was passionate about the environment. She was passionate about nature, but she always remembered that she was Prime Minister whose primary responsibility was abolition of poverty, creation of jobs, bringing new industry. So I think she was walking on two legs. She always stressed the word she used throughout the 16 years of her prime ministership. I discovered the most frequently used phrase was ecological balance. She kept talking about balance between ecology and economy. And sometimes, as Mr. Ravi pointed out, her choice fell on the economy. But sometimes the choice fell on ecology. The Hindu played a major role in the Silent Valley campaign. And in Silent Valley, Mrs. Gandhi not only went against what the CPM government in Kerala wanted, they wanted the project, but more importantly, even the Congress party in Kerala wanted the Silent Valley project. Even the great Mr. Karunakaran, who was her closest sort of colleague in Kerala, was for the Hydel project. But she stood firm and she said, Silent Valley must be protected at all costs. That is an example where she intervened in favor of ecology. Let me give you an example where she favored economy. There was an oil refinery that was to be set up. And the location that was selected by the experts was Mathura. 60 kilometers from the Taj Mahal, 50 kilometers from Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary. And there was a lot of concern by environmentalists at that time. We're talking of 73, by the way. But she said, she gave the green signal, she laid the foundation stone for the Mathura oil refinery, but she told the oil chaps that you go across the world and find the best expertise for controlling pollution from this refinery. So Indian Oil made huge investments, and the commissioning of that refinery was delayed by 5 years because of the need to protect the Taj Mahal and the need to protect the Bharatpur refinery. So that is an example where she actually let her ecological instincts at the back and allowed the location to be dictated by economic considerations.
But there are other projects too, like for example, Narmada River project started in her lifetime, and it is an ecological disaster.
No,
Then we
there's
have
a
the
small correction. Small correction. The Narmada project got clearance on the 13th of April 1987, long after she had
Yeah,
died.
but
But
the project started in her
She
lifetime.
kept
And
on. See, Mrs. Gandhi's tactic for delaying a project was to commission studies. So on Narmada, she commissioned master plans, she commissioned this study, that study. Tehri Dam. As long as Indira Gandhi was alive, Tehri Dam was not a reality. Tehri Dam becomes a reality only in the early 90s. See, I think towards the later part of her life, Mrs. Gandhi began to get suspicious of giganticism. She was enamored of giganticism. After all, the Bakra Nangals of the world. She was the product of that era.
She's
But
the
I
daughter
think
of Nehru, too.
So was Nehru. But as she went along, on dams particularly, Silent Valley is a good example, Tehri is a second example, Narmada is a third example, she was very cautious. And issues of resettlement, rehabilitation, she was very, very concerned. And there is elaborate correspondence which I have quoted on these dam issues between her and various chief ministers, Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, Chief Minister of Gujarat. They all happened to be Congress chief ministers at that time. But yet, she was fighting a battle on behalf of ecology. So I think that, she took, look, I am not, her record, Mathura refinery, I think is a question mark. Another big question mark is the Kudremukh
I was going to
iron ore
ask you.
project.
It's in the middle of the Kudremukh National Park.
No, absolutely. Kudremukh, and I have explained why the Kudremukh decision got taken, because India had $2 billion of foreign exchange reserves. Today we have 350 billion. But those were the days when we had 2 billion foreign exchange reserves, and the Iranians were giving us $600 million virtually free, and we were building this big economic partnership with Iran. So Iran was investing in the Kudremukh project, but Kudremukh turned out to be, very harmful for the local ecology in retrospect. And finally, the Supreme Court had to stop the project in 2005.
Similarly, there are some more. Thal Walshet, fertilizer, Nhava Sheva Port, Thane, then the Lalpur Dam in Gujarat. These are all blots on her environmentalism.
These are examples. Another example where she allowed the Indian Navy to set up a training establishment in the middle of Chilka. Well, Chilka is one of the greatest ecological national park sanctuaries that we have, bird sanctuary we have. And the Indian Navy was allowed after 2-3 years to set up a boys training establishment. So, she was, that's why I say she's not a pure environmentalist. She had passion for nature. She was concerned about deforestation. She started using words like climate change in the late 70s. Incidentally, one of the things that people don't know about Stockholm speech in 1972, which bears recalling today, because today every prime minister and every president is talking about climate change. In 1972, first UN conference on the human environment, 113 countries attend. Only one prime minister attends. Only one prime minister. The other prime minister who attends has to receive the delegations. Olaf Palme, he is the host prime minister. The only prime minister who goes and speaks at Stockholm is Indira Gandhi. Today you have an environment summit. Every president, barring Trump of course, every president will go and make a speech and say that I'm for climate change, I'm for environment protection. But in 1972, for Indira Gandhi, environment is a fashionable issue, is a popular issue today. In the 70s, environment was not a major political issue. Today we have activists, we have the media, we have NGOs, we have international concern. But in the 70s, Nandita, the whole atmosphere was different.
My father told me I was eccentric when I spoke about the environment in the 70s. So that's what people thought. I'd like you to explain one sentence. which Ravi also mentioned, are not poverty and need the greatest polluters. Or as she is often quoted, poverty is the greatest polluter. It's a sentence with double meaning. Can you explain to me what you think she meant? Because it can be taken in a very negative way.
Well, you know, political leaders often, statements are attributed to leaders which they have never made. But we would like those leaders to have made those statements. The most famous quotation of Mahatma Gandhi, which every environmentalist swears by: there is enough in this world for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. Now, I have it on the authority of Gopal Gandhi that Mahatma Gandhi never made this statement. But he is quoted as having made this statement. It's a nice statement. It's a brilliant statement to make. We always think that Mahatma Gandhi is very good. Indira Gandhi is often, everybody says, she said in Stockholm, poverty is the greatest polluter. Poverty is the worst form of pollution. She never said that.
But she did say
only
poverty
said,
and need.
are not poverty and need the worst polluters? Now, the context of this, the question that you're asking, the context of this was, she's going to Stockholm as Prime Minister of a poor country, and she's telling the world that, remember, in the 70s, environment was still a Western preoccupation. And environment was seen through the lens of two things. One, chemical contamination, pollution, and so on and so forth. Second was population explosion. These were the two perspectives that governed environmental discussion. What Mrs. Gandhi does in Stockholm is introduce a third dimension, which is poverty. And she says, look, for countries like India, we must protect the environment, but we must not forget that poverty remains our biggest challenge. And it's a form of pollution because what it does is it degrades the land, it leads to deforestation, it can lead to other adverse consequences, and therefore, as Prime Minister of India, I must balance my poverty challenge with my environment challenge. I think that's what she was trying to convey.
But you know, it also gives, I've always had a problem with that sentence, you know, poverty and need the greatest polluters, because it's as if to say that the poor people are polluting the land, you know, because of their poverty. You know, it's talking about, you immediately get into mine slums and things like that, which they can't help.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, that sentence, if you look at in the context of the paragraph, she's talking about urbanization, she's talking about the pressure, demographic pressure on land, she's talking of the pressures on forest resources. So there is a certain context to that statement, but I don't disagree with you that the statement is liable to be interpreted as saying that it's the poor who cause the pollution. Whereas actually we know that much of the pollution comes from lifestyles. You know, it comes from pollution that is caused by massive industrialization, by by diesel guzzling SUVs and so on and so forth. We know that. So yeah, in that way, I suppose you're right. But I tend to look at it from the international context, where she was telling the world community that, look, for India, we have to walk on two legs. We have to look at poverty, and we have to look at environment. These are not mutually exclusive.
One more form of pollution. We are talking about pollution. At the Non-Aligned Summit in 1983, a year before she died, she says, nuclear and chemical weaponry is suicidal and genocidal. True security is, and I'm cutting down a lot of the other things, true security is the saving of life, our lives of humans of all species. Yet, in 1974, she detonated the first, peaceful nuclear explosion or something. There's a dichotomy here.
By the way, Indira Gandhi never used the word peaceful nuclear explosion. She always called it peaceful nuclear experiment. And throughout the book, you will notice, she writes a long letter to Olaf Palme justifying what happened on the 18th of May 1974. And that decision was taken 2 years earlier. And I think yes, it was, whether she had decided to go for nuclear weapons or not, I'm not in a position to judge because I don't have any primary material to back that. But yes, it was a nuclear experiment which was to lead, it would have inevitable consequences of India, at some stage becoming a nuclear weapon power. But towards the later part, in the 80s particularly, she becomes a great champion of disarmament. She becomes, and the interesting thing about Indira Gandhi, she links the peace movement with the environmental movement. She says that the peace movement without the ecological movement is incomplete, and the ecological movement without the peace movement is incomplete. So she talks about both these things. I don't think there is a dichotomy, Nandita. I think she was addressing the USA and the USSR, the two big superpowers, which had accumulated a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons, enough to obliterate the world twice over. And I think she became a very ardent advocate of disarmament, but she also could not forget that we were living in a nuclear neighborhood. The Chinese had detonated the nuclear weapon in 1964. In 1967, they had done the hydrogen bomb experiment. And of course, Pakistan was to follow a couple of years later. So I don't see necessarily a dichotomy in Indira Gandhi being responsible for 18th of May, Pokhran 1, and later emerging as a big champion of disarmament. I think those are two sides of the same coin.
To go to a slightly different subject, she wanted to preserve the built heritage. But in her lifetime, she didn't even think of bringing in a National Heritage Act. Cities like Chennai, we are suffering without a Heritage Act. And so many other places also, it becomes a very difficult thing for local people. Connected to that is also Buckminster Fuller. She blows hot and cold about him all through her life. So can you, since this is about architecture, the built heritage, can you talk about these?
I think one of the uniqueness of Mrs. Gandhi was that she looked at nature and culture as two sides of the same coin. For her, the conservation of the built heritage was as important as the conservation of the natural heritage. In fact, she goes to visit Pokhran in December of 1974. She wants to visit the site of the peaceful nuclear experiment, as she calls it. And then she spends more time visiting the Havelis of Jaisalmer than, actually at Pokhran, the site of the nuclear explosion. She was extraordinarily concerned about preservation of culture. She, as you said, in 1982, she tries to replicate the UK experiment of having a national trust through an act of parliament to protect India's heritage. Unfortunately, that doesn't materialize, and she's killed in October 1984, and then INTAC gets formed. But INTAC doesn't get formed through an act of parliament. It's a private society. It's not a national trust of the type that the UK has, and what she had actually envisaged. Yes, but there's a very interesting episode in this book about a mosque in Bidar. It's a 16-pillar mosque in Bidar, a historic mosque, 500 years old. And Devraj Urs writes to her and saying that this mosque, there is a pressure for opening this mosque for prayers from the local community. And she writes a very angry letter back to Devraj Urs, saying that India's natural heritage belongs to every Indian. It should not be monopolized by one section or the other. So let this remain as a tribute to the people who built, the fort and the mosque, and not be used by a small section. This is Elephanta Island, the way she intervened to protect Elephanta. That's another good example. Jaisalmer is another example. Protecting forts in forest areas. The Bharatpur fort is an example where she focuses on culture. But yes, not enough was done. I think she did a lot for nature, but for protection of cultural heritage, maybe she could have been far more aggressive.
Because she was Prime Minister for nearly 20 years, 18.
Years, yeah.
So she had a lot of time.
She did, but you know, unfortunately, I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, both nature and culture, prime ministers have no control over. It's only chief ministers. And if you look at the battle that she fought with Mr. Karunanidhi on Mudumalai and the Madras Deer Park, or the battles that she fought with Arjun Singh on the Bastar forest, or the battle that she fought with V.P. Nayak, the Chief Minister of Maharashtra. V.P. Nayak wanted Back Bay reclamation. Those of you who know Bombay, V.P. Nayak wanted Back Bay reclamation. Indira Gandhi wanted New Bombay. But finally, if V.P. Nayak had his way, Back Bay reclamation became a reality. New Bombay got, receded into the background. So, she is often portrayed as an authoritarian. Mr. Ravi also used that phrase. She is portrayed as an authoritarian personality. In matters of culture and nature, she was anything but authoritarian. She was writing letters, she was scheduling, persuading. That time no phones were working, so she had to write letters. She would meet people, she would talk to people. She did not the image of her as an authoritarian leader is not borne out by her record on the protection of nature or on the protection of our cultural heritage.
But she was, she did control a lot of Congress chief ministers. So why did she put up with the two Shuklas, father and son?
In fact, Nandita, those of you who will read this book will discover that Congress chief ministers were defying her. V.P. Nayak defied her on New Bombay and Back Bay reclamation. Shama Charan Shukla defied her on the shooting of
She could have got rid of him. Because she's written such strong letters.
Very strong, very strong. She was upset with H.N. Bahuguna because Bahuguna was not doing anything about the Dudhwa sanctuary. I'll give you another unusual example. She wanted the central government to take over the management of Bharatpur and Sariska. But the two chief ministers she had personally installed as chief ministers of Rajasthan, Barkatullah Khan and Hardev Joshi, resisted her. Now, if you read any biography of Indira Gandhi, you will read that Indira Gandhi made CMs at will and dismissed CMs at will. That's not what this record shows. What this record shows is time and time and time again, chief ministers belonging to her own party would receive her letter, would write nice letters back to her, but actually on the ground were doing nothing. Till she actually then went and, did some personal cajoling, or she passed laws.
Yeah.
The Wildlife Protection Act was passed, the Forest Conservation Act was passed, the Water Pollution Control Act was passed. Do you know that in the 1970s, no state in India wanted the central government to pass the Water Pollution Control Act? Except there was one state which had an act, Maharashtra. So every state government said, we will pass our own act. What is the need for the center to pass an act? So it took 6 years, from 1968 to 1974, for the Water Pollution Control Act to become a reality. It took another 6 years for the Air Pollution Control Act to become a reality. So this split constitutional jurisdiction between the center and state, it continues to be an issue today.
It's still an issue.
It continues to be an issue today. It was very much an issue during Indira Gandhi's time. And I, for one, was enormously surprised when I saw how chief ministers whom she had appointed were continuously leading her up the garden path by replying to her letters very nicely, but actually doing nothing on the ground.
I think that's about Indian politics itself. I have not understood from your book whether she was pro or anti Buckminster Fuller. Tell us something.
She was fascinated with Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah.
Buckminster Fuller, the father of the geodesic,
Geodesic
dome.
We have
a
one
cult-
in our.
a
We
cult
have one in our.
here in Chennai.
Yes, in our campus.
Oh.
You walk past it.
So, I mean, once upon a time, Buckminster Fuller was this great guru, the futurist guru. He came to India. He was fascinated by Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi wanted him to design the Delhi airport, the Bombay airport, the Srinagar airport. But I think Buckminster Fuller proved too much for the Indian bureaucracy finally. And finally, the Indian bureaucracy ran circles around him. And she then till the very end, she ended up quoting Buckminster Fuller. But actually getting Buckminster Fuller in, I think she was very reluctant. One other unusual thing, Mrs. Gandhi is often portrayed to be anti-American. She was anti-Nixon. She was anti-Kissinger, no doubt about it. And Nixon and Kissinger did enough to earn Indira Gandhi's irritation and anger. But in that battle, she won the battle with Nixon and Kissinger. However, in the 70s, when our relationship with the US was rock bottom, the only people she would intervene on behalf of were American scholars studying Indian wildlife and Indian nature. There was an American called Stephen Green, and there was an Englishman called John Oates, and another American scholar called Karen Minkowski. They were working in the Kalakadu forest on the lion-tailed macaw. They were not getting visas to come to India because it was impossible to come to India in the 70s if you were a research scholar. They appealed to Salim Ali. Salim Ali appeals to Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi makes sure that these guys get the visas. So Stephen Green then produces this report on lion-tailed macaws in the Kalakadu, which then gets declared as a national sanctuary in 1976. In fact, President's rule in Tamil Nadu was extraordinarily fortunate for nature and wildlife because the Madras Deer Park gets declared as a sanctuary during President's rule. Kalakadu sanctuary gets declared during President's rule. So sometimes President's rule has its advantages. You know. Actually, she never had this bias, and she circulated these reports which these American scholars produced on lion-tailed macaws. She writes a letter to the chairman of the UGC, and she writes to D. Nag Chaudhary, Vice Chancellor of JNU, saying, why can't Indian scholars produce such reports? Why do we have to depend on foreigners? And that is when she has this idea of setting up the Wildlife Institute of India. And today the Wildlife Institute of India in Dehradun is one of our premier centers for issues relating to wildlife conservation.
You know, she had very strong views about killing wildlife. She even objected to gifts of tiger skins like the Maharaja of Rewa, whom you've mentioned. And a very beautiful statement, is man important or the tiger? In answer to that, she says, there's no conflict between the two. In fact, there's a close linkage between man and nature. We are but one of several thousand species of living beings. And I think that sort of sums up a lot of things she said. But she has also said a lot of other things about other places, like, for example, Manali. When somebody wanted to develop it, she wants it to be retained as a place for contemplation with the forests and all. Would you like to read that? Talk about that. And she says, sorry, I must interrupt, it should not become like one of many other hill stations, which includes Ooty. And I can assure you, Ooty is the worst example of a hill station.
Yeah. Well, one related point, since you are authoring a book on Hinduism and nature, one thing that I was struck by Indira Gandhi in 16 years that she was Prime Minister. On every public occasion, she would reach for the Vedas and the Upanishads or some ancient Indian scholarly tradition to make the point that nature protection should come naturally to us Indians. I've given you the example of the Stockholm speech where she quotes from the Atharva Veda. She quotes from the Rig Veda umpteen occasions. And there is one beautiful letter that she writes to Swami Chidananda, who is the president of the Divine Life Society. And the Swami Chidananda writes to Indira Gandhi saying that Himalayas are being destroyed. Please save the Himalayas. And Mrs. Gandhi writes back to the Swami saying, Dear Swamiji, I agree with you. We are faced with a huge challenge. And then she quotes something to the Swami. It's like carrying coals to Newcastle, but she couldn't resist it. She said, what our ancients had said about dharma is also applicable to nature. If you remember, the ancient saying is, dharmo rakshati rakshataha. Dharma protects those who protect it. And what Indira Gandhi did was, she changed it to prakriti rakshati rakshataha. Nature protects those who protect it. The point I want to make is, she's constantly looking for civilizational roots to drive home the public message that you need to protect rivers, you need to protect mountains, you need to protect forests. She talks in many places. In one place, she says, how many cultures have a book, a holy book, named after a forest? The Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Not just Aranyaka, but Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, the great forest Upanishad. So the language which she is using is something that she is conveying to people that, look, you are legatees of a certain culture in which nature gets protected. I can't resist here, she in her Stockholm speech, she starts off her Stockholm speech by saying that, in India, we are taught to respect nature. And she gives this example of a journalist who goes to Pandit Nehru in May of 1953 with the most exciting news that Mount Everest has been conquered. And Nehru gets very upset and says, never say Mount Everest has been conquered. Nature cannot be conquered. Mount Everest has been climbed. It has not been conquered. This example she gives in a speech to a global audience. And she goes to the Forest Research Institute of India in Dehradun, and she's telling the foresters, remember that people have a relationship with forests in India that go beyond the Indian Forest Service. That we are taught to respect our forests. We are taught to respect nature. The concept of sacred groves, the concept of protecting areas, which are valuable to us from every point of view. So this cultural thing of environment is very important. She's looking for the cultural roots. And I think it is not an exaggeration to say that maybe, I'm making too much of a generalization, but it is not an exaggeration to say that Western civilization is based on the assumption that man can conquer nature. Indian civilization has been based on the assumption or on the belief that man can live in harmony with nature. And she was searching for that harmony. Sometimes she was successful, sometimes she was unsuccessful. But I think that was a continuing search for her. And I wish all politicians in India were like her in searching for this harmony. Because there is if you start thinking that you're going to conquer nature, then you will have what you had in tsunami in 2004. When you destroy the entire mangroves and nature hits back at you. What happened in Uttarakhand in 2013? what happened in the southern coast of India in 2004, in my view, is nature's payback to what man has done to nature. I think this is one of the most important messages that comes out of her prime ministership.
Sorry. For those who don't know, she was responsible for 4 acts, as Jairam just said: Wildlife Prevention Act, Water Pollution Act, the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, and the Forest Conservation Act. These are all acts that help us very well. She was responsible for Project Lion and Project Tiger, for the lion-tailed macaque. She's done a tremendous number of things for the environment. Why has your own party not given her sufficient praise for her environmental achievements?
Well, I think this evening has got nothing to do with the Congress party. I think, frankly, Indira Gandhi was the first and last prime minister. Indira Gandhi was the first and last prime minister. Indira Gandhi was the first and last prime minister who came to environment and nature not just from her head but also from her heart. I think the pressure on political leaders to show visible symbols of growth is very great. That it requires an unusual personality to say that, no, I'm not going to have this Heidel project because it's going to destroy the rainforest in the Western Ghats. It requires somebody who's thinking of a different wavelength, who's thinking of the future generation to say, no, I'm not going to allow roads and rails through these corridors because this is going to destroy forests and that is going to have deleterious consequences for people. I think, to my mind, she was really, every prime minister in India, every political leader in India, not just prime minister, all political leaders, they pay obeisance to nature. They talk of Indian nature, they talk of the fact that, we have gods and goddesses after animals, forests, rivers, mountains. But when it comes to the crunch, Nandita, when it comes to making choices, Mrs. Gandhi was the only prime minister who made tough choices. All other prime ministers have tried to, all other leaders, not just prime ministers, all other leaders have tried to keep the rhetoric of environment and nature, but the reality is visible symbols of progress. Visible. We must have visible, So laws get flouted, regulations get flouted routinely, and there has been a tradition on this, and unfortunately, but one thing that Indira Gandhi did, she made environment politically respectable. She brought environment into the mainstream of the political discourse. She created the Ministry of Environment. She was the first minister. She was minister for 4 years, till the day she died. And it's interesting, 3 days before she is killed, on the 28th of October, 1984, she has this enormous desire to go and see the chinar tree change colors in Srinagar. She's been going to Kashmir since 1934, but she's never seen the chinar change color. So she goes to see the chinar change color, and she comes back. And the last thing that she does before she's assassinated, the last written thing that she does, because 30th she goes to Bhubaneswar, 31st she comes back and she's shot dead. On the 28th, 29th she goes into Bhubaneswar, spends 2 days there. On the 28th night, she writes a foreword to a book that was written by her Deputy Minister for Environment, Digvijay Singh of Wankaner. And the book is about how you make environment politically acceptable. And I think Mrs. Gandhi's great contribution was that environment came into the mainstream. Political parties started taking environmental issues. The Congress Party's manifesto of 1980 was the first manifesto. It was drafted, the paragraph was drafted by P.V. Narasimha Rao and Pranab Mukherjee, but the paragraph was given by Salim Ali. Salim Ali sent the paragraph, and Mr. Narasimha Rao and Mr. Pranab Mukherjee translated it into this gobbledygook English, which finds its place in all manifestos.
Mr. Narasimha Rao thought she should be a botany professor.
Oh, there's a hilarious story which I quote, where there is a Sri Lankan professor called Ralph Bulchins. Mr. Ram must know him very well. Ralph Bulchins was a very close friend of Indira Gandhi, and he came to India in 1978 when Indira Gandhi had lost the power. And he, Narasimha Rao, and Indira Gandhi were going in a car to Mysore. And the Bangalore-Mysore road is full of trees on both sides, wonderful old trees. And Indira Gandhi was recounting the names of all the trees as they drove. And after about 45 minutes, there was a huge crowd waiting. So she gets out of the car and she goes to meet the crowd. And Narasimha Rao turns to Ralph Bulchins and says, she should have been a botany teacher and not in politics.
Thank you. Before we start the interaction, is there any part of the book you'd like to read out?
I would, one part of the, one section, one very quick section. On 25th of March 1985, Prakash Narayan, the Secretary of the Union Ministry of Shipping and Transport, announced in Madras that the government of India had decided not to establish the National Institute. You will understand why I'm quoting this paragraph very shortly. Had decided not to establish the National Institute of Port Management on the shore near the city's Adyar estuary and would identify an alternative location. This was a victory for the environmental activists of Madras, who had been agitating for quite some time to protect the ecologically fragile area with its mangroves, which was home to a wide variety of avian visitors. A few weeks before she was killed, Indira Gandhi had in fact bowed to the demands of the activists, but the formal announcement to shift the institute to another site had not been made. Nandita Krishna, a key player in that episode, recalled to me what had happened. And this is what Nandita Krishna wrote. Out of sheer desperation, I wrote to Mrs. Indira Gandhi and followed it with a telegram. The response was startling. Within 2 days, the local director of the Port Management Institute came home to apologize and said that they had decided to shift the location away from the Adyar estuary and asked me whether I had any objection to Uthandi on the East Coast Road. I told him I was nobody to approve or object, but I was concerned with the ecology of the Adyar estuary and wanted it to remain sacrosanct. The Port Management Institute was shifted out of Adyar immediately and went to Uthandi. Later, it became the Indian Maritime University through an act of parliament.
Otherwise, I'll choose something for you to read. I think this last. What she wrote in her.
Yeah. On 30th November 1984, a book published for the Smithsonian Institution titled Our Green and Living World, The Wisdom to Save was released. It was written by 4 leading conservation scientists and had an epilogue by Indira Gandhi, penned the previous July. In fact, when Edward Ayansu, one of the authors and the main force behind the book, had sent Indira Gandhi a draft foreword, she had penciled, "It is my foreword, I have to write it myself." You know, when prime ministers write books, you can be rest assured that somebody has written it for them. But this was Indira Gandhi saying, "It's my foreword, I have to write it myself." What she wrote deserves mention. And this is the point that I made earlier. For countless centuries, Indian civilization has proclaimed the oneness of all existence and the unity of life and non-life. It is ironical that when this ancient tenet of Indian philosophy is being recognized by the world, our own people, that is Indians, our own people are allowing deforestation and the extinction of various species. The compulsions of development, the pressures of population, and the greed for profit have all combined to threaten our forests, our animals, and the very air we breathe. Already, the whole world and my own country have lost a great deal by neglecting the ecological equilibrium. Little time is now left to us. Human beings can thrive only in a green and living world. The problems of the environment have to be faced by the world as one.
Please identify yourself, just ask a question, and Mr. Jairam Ramesh will give you the answer if it is related to Indira Gandhi and her ecology. Please don't go into anything else. Okay, this gentleman, can you identify yourself, please? No, the gentleman behind you.
My name is Ramakrishnan. I am a writer. You quoted the fact that Indira Gandhi said that poverty is a pollution. That poverty was simply a fact. It was a fact because of policy failures. India could have become rich and environmentally clean if the right policies had been adopted.
No rich country is environmentally clean, by the way. It's a no rich country, communist or non-communist. Nobody is environmentally clean. India has one great advantage. We need not follow the American model. We need not follow the Chinese model. We need not follow the Brazilian model. That model is grow now, pay later. You have 20 years of growth and you pay the consequences of growth 20 years later. India can actually be an exception to this, provided we think that environment is an integral part of growth and not as an cost of growth.
This is Vidya Venkat from The Hindu. Sir, I have a couple of questions. To what extent do you think Indira Gandhi's successors could do justice to her environmental legacy? Because Bhopal happened in '84 and we all know what was done to the perpetrators. Then after that, I also wanted to know if you are, in publishing this book, you're trying to send across a message to the present government, which doesn't have a very good reputation when it comes to environmental matters. Also, do you think her challenges in governance was because she was a woman? Because that aspect has not been addressed.
Well, Vidya, no message to the present government. Okay? This is a book on Indira Gandhi, a historical figure, a political figure, a charismatic figure, a controversial figure, a contradictory figure. And I've tried to unravel a personal side of Indira Gandhi, which very few people know about, very few appreciate. No message. If you want a message, a prerogative. But I am not sending any message. Your third question. Mrs. Gandhi was not an environmentalist in the strict sense of the term. She was not a feminist in the strict sense of the term. She never thought of herself. In fact, she resented being called a feminist. And what was said about Margaret Thatcher was also said about Indira Gandhi. In fact, it was said of Indira Gandhi before it was said of Margaret Thatcher, that she was the only man in her. This was about Indira Gandhi in the early 70s. So she never, this gender dimension she didn't. But, in one case, she talked about, Golda Meir, before it was said of Golda Meir. On one issue, she talks of the gender dimension, and that's the Chipko movement. She gives a long interview to Anil Agarwal, which I have quoted, where she talks about women coming out and protecting the forests. And I think Indira Gandhi was beginning to realize that forest management has very strong gender component. Initially, she doesn't recognize, but towards the later part of her tenure, she begins to talk about women walking long distances for collecting firewood, women walking long distances for collecting fodder. In fact, in the early 70s, in the mid 70s, she's not talking about women and forests. But in the 80s, whenever she talks forests, she's talking women. She's talking gender. So I think she's beginning towards the 80s to get increasingly aware of the central role of gender issues in forest management, which most foresters, in fact, actually ignore. What was your first question? I answered 2 of your 3 questions. Bhopal. Well, Bhopal happened on the night of 2nd December 1984, a month and 2 days after she was assassinated. What the consequence of Bhopal was the Environment Protection Act of 1986, which is the mother act which governs environmental approvals in this country, coastal zone regulations and all that. That's the mother act. It's a very powerful act. And the background to that act was, there were 2 backgrounds to that act. One was Bhopal, and the other one was T.N. Seshan, equal impact. Mr. Seshan was the Secretary Environment. Bhopal happened, Mr. Seshan becomes Secretary Environment in September 1985, and they come up with this Environment Protection Act. But remember that the 4 basic acts, Wildlife Protection Act, the Control of Water Pollution Control Act, the Control of Air Pollution Control Act, and the Forest Conservation Act, came during Indira Gandhi's time. And I want to say one final comment on this. Normally, it's the bureaucracy that moves files, and prime ministers give their dhobi mark. In these 4 cases, it's the prime minister who directed the bureaucracy to do what they did. It was not the bureaucracy telling Indira Gandhi, bring a Forest Conservation Act. It was Indira Gandhi telling the Joint Secretary, this is how I want the Forest Conservation Act. This is how I want the Wildlife Protection Act. That's the difference. I think she put a lot of her personal reputation, personal interest at stake. So her legacy has continued. Ministry of Environment has not been dismantled. None of these laws, they still exist, although determined efforts are being made to emasculate the laws and the ministry and so on and so forth. But things have moved on. Today there is greater public consciousness and I will just make one comment on the current government, and I won't say anything more. The determined efforts being made now to completely emasculate the National Green Tribunal, which was set up in 2010, that is reflective of a certain mindset. And that mindset says environment is a regulatory burden, and that we must minimize the regulatory burden. But Indira Gandhi's mindset was, environment is not a regulatory burden. Environment is something that you must internalize as part of your growth process, because you're protecting your natural resources.
I'd just like to add to what he said, the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act, she personally changed it to Wildlife Protection Act. Mr. Ram.
Now that you're a free man, you can I'd like to ask you this question. Towards the end, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh seemed to have a problem with this balancing, and maybe he came down very hard on the side of the economy. That's among others, that manifestations of that was you were shifted to a more heavyweight ministry, but we know why. Would you be able to give us some insights into this?
Well, I went from a ministry which had a budget of 2,000 crores to a ministry which had a budget of 100,000 crores. So I was, you could say, vertically elevated. I think it's not personalities, Mr. Ram. I think the dominant paradigm after 1991 is a single-minded pursuit of high GDP growth. I think that's the dominant paradigm. Let's have 25 to 30 years of 8% growth. We'll become a middle-income country, and then we'll worry about the consequences of pollution, deforestation, and so on and so forth. That was the dominant paradigm that governed the economic reforms in 91. And I think it's not one individual, it's that whole mindset. And by the way, I also subscribed to that mindset in 1991, It's only when I became Environment Minister in 2009 that I became slightly more nuanced and said, okay, we need the growth, but there may be occasions in which we have to make choices. And these choices may end up saying no to some of these projects. Mining, for example, mining projects in forest areas, or hydel projects in ecologically sensitive areas. So I think it's the dominant political parties, when they're out of power, discover the virtues of environmental protection. Political parties, when they come to power, discover the virtues of economic growth. And so you find that, I'll give you an example, because you picked on the Congress party, so let me give the Congress party's example. The Congress party in Kerala, when it was in power, Athirapalli is the modern Silent Valley project that is being planned in Kerala. I put a stop to the Athirapalli project, but my own colleagues in Kerala said, no, one Silent Valley was enough. We want to implement the Athirapalli project. Now that the UDF is not in power, the UDF has passed a resolution that we are against the Athirapalli project. But the LDF is now pushing the Athirapalli project. So this is the, dynamics of power, because chief ministers are judged by the number of factories they set up, the number of buildings they build, the number of investments they get, and not by the amount of protection, investments they make in environmental protection. So, it would be unfair to single out one individual, but I think the dominant paradigm has been since 1991, let's go whole hog with economic growth, and then sort of, worry about the consequences. What I call the grow now, pay later model.
Were you, in your revisionist phase, influenced by Indira Gandhi's example in a personal sense, when you said you moved away from this?
2009, yes. In 2009, I was actually not aware of the depth of her commitment. I mean, when I began to read all the things that she had done, and as minister, you get a particularly advantageous position. When I talked to people, the first time I met Nandita, for example, many people, I was really taken aback by how Mrs. Gandhi approached. By the way, I must tell you, since you asked me to be a little honest, I will be a little honest. Only a little, not very. I was shocked and surprised when I was made environment minister. I did not expect to be made environment minister. I thought it was a demotion. I had spent time as commerce and power, so I was looking for more attractive things to do. And suddenly I am asked to become environment minister. And I thought that this was, sort of kiss of death as far as I was concerned. But as I spent a little time into it, a few days, in fact, a few weeks, I discovered that this is central. This is the central challenge of our times. Forest management, pollution, climate change, these are central issues which govern the trajectory of our growth. And certainly, Indira Gandhi, my admiration for Indira Gandhi has gone up manifold after writing this book. Like all Indians, I was in awe of her, and like all Indians, I was critical of her as well. In awe of her because of 1971, bank nationalization, etc., etc. But also, there is a record of the 1975 emergency also. So we can't run away from historical facts. But after writing this book, and everything in this book is primary archival material. No oral recollection, no memory. It's all written material, and all mostly written by her. I'm amazed that a prime minister, buffeted by political crisis and economic crisis in the 70s and early 80s, could actually find the time to do all these things. When Bangladesh was happening, she was involved in the Wildlife Protection Act. When Punjab and Assam were big political issues, she was spending time on Silent Valley. So I was actually amazed that a prime minister could devote that much amount of time, which reflected in many ways, therefore, her personal commitment. A personal commitment became a public calling. And this was the only personal commitment she made a public calling. She was also a practitioner of yoga every day, but she never advertised the fact that she did yoga every day. Vidya, have I answered your question?
My name is Ganesh. I am a assistant professor in media. I would like to ask a question like, did she talk about modernization per se and link it up with the development and environment and all that? We know that we wanted modernization like the West, like Nehru set up the IITs and IIMs. But did you come across anywhere like she has said something about modernization, westernization, and problems you might encounter on that account in Indian continent or something like that?
Absolutely. She kept talking about the fact that India will she kept talking of the fact that we need more industrialization. And I'll give you, those of you who are Bombay very well, in fact, that is one decision on which I disagree with her as somebody who grew up in Bombay. Chembur, there is a suburb of Bombay called Chembur, and it's popularly known as gas chamber because it has refineries, it has power stations, it has fertilizer plants. And in the 70s, Indira Gandhi allowed a fertilizer factory expansion in Chembur, even though it was known that it was going to create a lot of environmental stress on economic grounds. There was getting World Bank money, it was an existing plant, expansion was easy, a greenfield plant would take 5 years, this would take 2 years. So they were pressing economic arguments, and she chose economic arguments over environmental arguments. So yes, she did talk about the fact that we need to create, India will need to modernize, we will need more irrigation, we will need more infrastructure, we will need faster growth. But I think she was sensitive enough to know that at times she would have to take a call. And she took a call. She took a call on many occasions. And the signal that she was sending was that, look, it's not always 100% automatic that what the economists say should become government policy, that there are other ways of achieving the same objective. And I think in this, people like Salim Ali, M. Krishnan, Billy Arjun Singh, Sundarlal Bahuguna, All these people played a very important role. You know, she had a large circle of friends outside the political system who were giving her ideas on nature, on protection, on environment, and she was responding creatively to it.
Yes, please identify yourself.
And discussion forum. The thing is, with the rise of present politics involving Sanders, Bernie Sanders, and Jeremy Corbyn in UK, you can see they are questioning the establishment politics, where they are working out a link between capitalism and ecology. But if you take the case of Indira Gandhi, she was very much an establishment politician, isn't it? And also the Congress party is very much an establishment party, so supporting and going along with capitalism, and you can see the excesses with the Vedanta driving out the tribal people and all sort of things. Could you answer that? And second question is, also, isn't the legacy of Indira Gandhi is also the legacy of Green Revolution, where instead of taking out the fetters of feudal era, like land reforms or radical land reforms, and assisting the small farmers with credits, the policies of Green Revolution actually led to dumping of fertilizers and insecticides, so spoiling the soil ecology. Thank you.
Response to your first question, capitalism has been enormously destructive of the environment, but so has communism. Some of the worst environmental disasters have been in the Soviet Union, erstwhile Soviet Union, and the erstwhile Central Asian, republics that were part of the Soviet Union. So it's got nothing to do with capitalism per se, or communism, or socialism. It's the model. It's the way you approach economic growth, the safeguards and the checks and balances that you put into economic growth. Unfortunately, the model, the dominant paradigm, which Bernie Sanders and Corbyn are challenging, and there's much sympathy I have with what they're saying. The dominant paradigm gives primacy to economic growth and puts sustainability as a subsidiary objective, as a secondary objective. I think it is possible for us to find an alternative way. I think India should find an alternative way. And I'm not saying that we go back to an era of no growth, but at the same time, I think it's possible to find a trajectory of growth that actually protects the environment, that is actually respectful of natural resources, and that is not destructive of natural resources. The Vedanta example that you gave is a good example. There are people who think that the Vedanta thing was reflective of economic growth, but actually there was a counter narrative to the Vedanta project as well. And a decision was taken. By the way, till today, that decision that was taken on stopping bauxite mining in Niyamgiri has not been reversed, even though the government has changed. Now, on this Green Revolution bit, I just want to, read out. There's a chapter, the first year that Indira Gandhi becomes Prime Minister. She signs a pledge. You won't believe this. This was the India of 1966. February 3rd, 1966, Indira Gandhi signs a pledge. Central Save Rise for Kerala Committee. And what does the pledge say? It says, I pledge to surrender my rice ration for the people of Kerala and authorize the Central Save Rise for Kerala Committee to send my pledge to the rationing authorities. My ration of rice may be utilized to meet the rice shortage in Kerala. I also pledge not to eat rice or serve rice till the food situation in Kerala is normal. Signed, Indira Gandhi, address, Prime Minister's House, 1 Safdarjung Road, ration card number 23/5/ND/526685. That time there was no Aadhaar number. This was the ration card number. This is a pledge that the Prime Minister of India signs. You are obviously born after 1966. You will not understand
There's a
what
terrible
India
famine.
went through in 66, 67 and 68. I was a young boy. I have listened to the Prime Minister making a request to Indians to miss a meal one day a week.
And we all missed it one day a week. You know, we really did it.
This was the India of
not given food.
1966. Monsoon failed in 66. Monsoon fails in 65. Monsoon fails in 66. Indira Gandhi goes to America. And Lyndon Johnson runs circles around her. And she comes back to India determined that India will never be in a position where she is dependent on some other country for rice and wheat. And that is how the Green Revolution starts. Now, I agree that Green Revolution had ecological consequences. Overuse of fertilizer, overuse of water, those are second generation effects. But the fact of the matter is, without the Green Revolution, India would not have led a life of dignity. We would not have been dignified Indians. It is the Green Revolution that gave India the strength to do many of the things that it did in the 70s and 80s. But I am the first, and Dr. Swaminathan, who is one of the
Architects.
Trimurti of the Green Revolution, so to speak, Dr. Swaminathan is the first to say that the Green Revolution was meant to address production shortages in rice and wheat. Now the time has come for us to address the ecological impacts in terms of fertilizer, in terms of water, in terms of soil health. But that does not mean that the decision to go for the Green Revolution was wrong. Don't make that mistake.
Hi, my name is Priya Ravichandran. So you mentioned a few times about her letters to Karunanidhi and various other chief ministers where she was fighting for national forest. So did she have any allies within any of the states who supported her and her
Zero.
environmental?
Zero.
Do you think
There is zero alliance she had. She was charting new territory. There was no political alliances. Her own, as I said, her own political party, and not many other political leaders who were talking about environmental issues. See, environment becomes a big issue only after the mid-80s. You know, Chipko movement in the late 70s, the Narmada movement in the mid-80s, and subsequently environment becomes a big issue. In the 70s, to my mind, she was really the only political personality. They were naturalists. The only political personality who was talking about environmental issues. So she had no allies.
do you think, or did you see in any of her writings an encouragement for states to take greater ownership and pride in their own natural resources? And do you think states now, given the focus on climate change and protection of natural resources, do you think states can now take a role in perhaps play in the international arena where they speak for
Yeah, they
I
can.
think
but
there is
let's
greater
stick to-
public awareness today, no doubt. There is greater public awareness. The media is more aware. There are social movements in India. There are NGOs in India. And there are certainly political leaders talking about, environmental issues. But the issue is not what you say. The issue is what you do. That's the difference, We can pay lip service. For every environmental act, we can quote a Sanskrit shloka. But if you don't understand the meaning of what you're chanting and you actually put it in practice, what's the point quoting these shlokas?
My name is Tamil Selvan from Shivakasi. This is regarding from your speech, Mathura Refinery. Mathura Refinery. Can you hear? Right, sir. During 1983, based on Madam Indira Gandhi's direction, Department of Environment, then Secretary, wrote a letter to UP Chief Secretary saying Taj Mahal must be protected. Even after 30 years, you can see the white sparkling Taj Mahal became a black. Now you are giving mud coating. You are the environment minister. I wrote a couple of letters to you. Under Environment Protection Act 1986, when a state government fails, Section 5AB says center can act. Now the Environment Secretary since Rajagopal time or since 1996 onwards, all the papers are in the file. The commissioner, TDZ, that is Agra commissioner, admitted, yes ma'am, admitted there is an illegal expansion happening in and around Taj Trapezium zone. As a lawmaker, do you have any responsibility to take charge on this government? Even I can go to say to our respected editor Ram sir, the environment minister himself is supporting illegal expansion. What you are going to do?
That one of the consequences of locating the refinery in Mathura was that the railway shunting yard in Agra was shifted out. 2 power plants were closed down, and about 250 small foundries were shifted out of the city. And there was a green belt in the Agra-Mathura area. These were all consequences, and it took almost 15 to 20 years after the refinery was set up. Now, one could argue that the refinery should not have been set up in the first place there. That's a separate argument, and to which I have much sympathy with. But to say that nothing has happened, I think that is a bit of an exaggeration. Section 5 of the Environment Protection Act is like Article 356 of the Constitution, you know? Do you know when the only occasion where Section 5 has been used was when I was Environment Minister and I closed down polluting industries on the Ganga. I used Section 5. And every political party, including the current Home Minister, every political party came to me and said, this is the wrong decision because you are interfering with the rights of the state governments. I'm destroying jobs because distilleries were closed, paper mills were closed, tanneries were closed, because none of them everybody was flouting the Environment Protection Act. So we used what you said, Section 5. But that has remained the first and last occasion where Section 5 has been used. Should Section 5 be used if a state government continuously flouts? I agree. I agree. Will it be used? No. Because this is politics. See, ultimately we live in a political system. Will the central government take on a state government? The central government can take on a state government on communal clashes, on caste violence, on social issues. But will a central government take on a state government on pollution? No. We have not that advanced as yet.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. My name is Harish. Sir. And regarding this one about the wildlife, sir, about the invasive species, that is now also recently it's very much popular, that Jolie flora and all the other type of invasive species, which is affecting our land and other resources also. Despite having a great act and all those things, what is the emphasis on that period on invasive species, sir? Because even only now in Tamil Nadu it has started to become an issue, and people around like 11,000 hectares have been removed. But all over India, is it possible now? Because that is the major thing to be looked upon. So about the invasive species.
Many wildlife sanctuaries are actually threatened by invasive species. In fact, one of the most common invasive species is called Congress grass. Because this came to India when we imported wheat. So it's called Congress grass. If you go to any sanctuary and if you see some wild thing growing, the forester will tell you, sir, that's Congress grass. So I tried my best to change that name when I was minister. Unfortunately, I couldn't succeed. It's still called Congress grass. Yeah, invasive species, very serious issue. A very important forest management issue is to control the growth of these invasive species. But sometimes The biggest invasive species is introduced by man deliberately. If you go to many national parks and sanctuaries, beautiful teak forest, suddenly in the middle you will discover eucalyptus. Now that is not nature's bounty. That is not nature's bounty. That is man's intervention. In this book, there is an example of how Arjun Singh wanted to replace the sal forest of Bastar by eucalyptus. And Mrs. Gandhi put her foot down. This is an example of a species which deliberately gets introduced, which destroys the ecological equilibrium. So some invasive species come naturally, but some invasive species come through man's conscious interventions. That we must avoid.
I'm Samashivam from Chennai. Earlier I was residing in Trichy. Interestingly, the kingmaker called Kamaraj, Mr. Kamaraj, he was responsible for making Indira Gandhi Prime Minister. He brought in BHEL to Trichy. Interestingly, BHEL adopted some afforestation practices and now it is a green area. Interestingly, after I migrated to Chennai, I find that the Adayar river is saturated with sewage water. And did Indira Gandhi compel companies to adopt afforestation practices? And the second question is, Indira Gandhi's father built many dams in India, which submerged a lot of forests and temples. Interestingly, his daughter Indira Gandhi was a nature lover. So, what do you think about this? It's a strange contradiction. And Abdul Kalam suggested the interlinking of rivers. So, Indira Gandhi, did she take any steps to interlink the rivers? No. Today, you find that Assam is flooded and Chennai is reeling under a drought-like condition. Had we interlinked the rivers, we would not be experiencing a water shortage today. And the last question would be, of course, the cows are also the part of environment. And what is your stance on the issue?
No, nothing political, please. We are
no, it is not a political issue. It is an environmental issue.
Cows.
Okay, that's an insignificant one.
I'll tell you an interesting episode on cows. On the 7th of November 1966, the first assault on Parliament took place. Who assaulted Parliament? Sadhus, cow protection activists. Police fired at them. There were some people who died. Home Minister Gulzari Lal Nanda resigned. Kamraj was attacked because Kamraj's house was right next to Parliament House. 6 months later, Indira Gandhi sets up a high-powered committee to go into the question of the national law on cow slaughter. What should we do on cow slaughter nationally? This committee has Charan Singh, Chief Minister of UP, as a member, D.P. Mishra, Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, as a member, and you won't believe it, M.S. Golwalkar, head of the RSS, as a member. Indira Gandhi makes Guru Golwalkar a member of a committee to examine the issue of a national law to ban cow slaughter. The committee meets for 12 years, from 1967 to 1979. It submits no report. Morarji Desai is Prime Minister. He disbands the committee. That committee, there is no report of that committee. However, there are two members of that committee, Ashok Mitra, the famous economist, and V. Kurian, India's Mr. Milk, who have written in their memoirs what happened in that committee. And I have quoted from those memoirs, so you read that on cow protection. Interlinking of rivers, I should not be saying this in Chennai, but interlinking of rivers is a recipe for ecological disaster. Small interlinking within basins is happening. But the Ken-Betwa link, which is going to be the first interlinking, is going to completely destroy the Panna Tiger Reserve. And it's not just a tiger reserve, it's a rich forest ecosystem. So I am not one of those, I'm a South Indian, but I am not one of those who believes that the problems of South India are going to be solved by linking the Brahmaputra and the Ganga with the southern rivers. Sorry, Navneeta Krishnan, you heard me say this in Parliament also. Your view is different, I know. So on interlinking of rivers, I do not subscribe to this view. I think it's a very, very serious environmental hazards associated with it.
And by the time it comes to Chennai, none of the states along the way will give us any water. So I think the time is up. Mr. Sambandam has been sending out messages. Okay, one person. Okay, Mr. Ramesh. Okay. I think if you can take all the questions together.
I'm Prince Daniel. I have a feedback to say and a question to ask. Is it audible? Yeah. I live in Besanagar, and I understand from the discussion that Adyar estuary was protected and it was saved by Madam's effort. Sincere thanks. You can pass it on. And sir, in addition to Wildlife Protection Act, there was a special attention for black buck protection you mentioned in the discussion. And today, an actor was freed out after shooting black buck. And do you think, had Indira Gandhi existed, would have been there a special intervention by Madam to have those law-abiding citizens handled? And you can add a line that verdict came out during this government's rule. And it was very disheartening to read on the day of the verdict. After the verdict was read out, the defense, the prosecution counsel asked, "My lord, the deer was dead, and I don't have an answer. The accused is freed out today." And the defense counsel answered, "The deer may have died of natural causes." So how do you see it?
My name is Gopi Varir. I write on environment. I basically wanted to ask, Indira Gandhi was a very powerful leader. She had political power at that point of time. Now, and she took very strong decisions. Now, one, would we have, do you see that any other somebody with that much of political power could ever take that kind of passionate environment decisions today, in today's scenario?
I'm Ramesh from the Business Line newspaper, and I have read your book. It's a very fascinating book, beautiful book. And when I read that, my reaction was, hell with Indira Gandhi and Jairam Ramesh, let me go and live in a forest. It's a lovely book. However, on a couple of points, you seem to say that Jayaprakash Narayan was as much responsible for the emergency as Indira Gandhi. Oh, come on, taking it too far.
You have not read my book carefully. I said, P.N. Dhar has written a book on the emergency. P.N. Dhar was Mrs. Gandhi's closest advisor, who was her interlocutor with Jayaprakash Narayan. And P.N. Dhar says 50% of the blame for the emergency must go to Indira Gandhi, 50% of it must go to Jayaprakash Narayan. I am not saying, I am quoting Jayaprakash Narayan. I am only quoting him. And I have quoted a letter that Sharda Prasad, the great Sharda Prasad, wrote to Natwar Singh on the 25th of July 1975, 1 month after the emergency is declared, that the great mistake that JP made was to allow the RSS to take control of the JP movement. This is Sharda Prasad writing to Natwar Singh. This is not the author writing, I'm just quoting. So look, this is not a book on the emergency. But what I think of the emergency is very clear in this book. What I think of the Maruti misadventure is very clear from the book. I mean, I don't have to. But that book is nothing to do with the emergency. So now on the black buck, what can I say? I mean, the law of the land took its course. But clearly black bucks had been shot. Clearly black buck shooting is illegal. And clearly the people who shoot black buck for pleasure or for money should invite the appropriate penalties. Which in this case, because they were high visible, high profile personalities, they somehow managed to escape. And I think that was a wrong signal. Mrs. Gandhi, as I answered to your question, yeah, she was a powerful political leader. But I think she remains, to my mind, the first and last political leader who made environment as much of her mission as food self-sufficiency, as industrialization or bank nationalization or independent foreign policy. For her, environment was not a footnote. It was as much part of her day-to-day activity. That's why what I have done, one of the criticisms of this book is that it's arranged chronologically. It's not arranged thematically. So it goes 66, 67, 68, 69, 70. And one of the reasons why it is arranged chronologically is to show how every year she was taking political decisions, she was taking economic decisions, and while she was taking political and economic decisions, she was also taking decisions on the environment. She is nationalizing banks and she is protecting the tiger. She is fighting a war with Pakistan and she is coming up with a Wildlife Protection Act. Examples like this. So I think as a political leader, to the best of my knowledge, I do not think there has been a prime minister like her, or a political leader, forget prime minister, a political leader like her who has made environmental protection as much part of her day-to-day decision making as foreign policy, economic policy, social policy, and so on and so forth.
It's up to you. Okay. I'd like to tell you at the end that this book is fascinating. I didn't want to say it at the beginning because I have read it. It is a fascinating book. I would suggest that the answers to all your questions are here, at least the Indira Gandhi period and Mr. Jairam Ramesh. I have worked with many environmental ministers, and I would like to say that the most environmentally conscious minister who believed in protecting the environment was Mr. Jairam Ramesh. So I'd like to thank the Hindu for organizing this. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, you can ask them outside.